Good morning, my name is Thomas Hurst and welcome to Kirklees Local TV's Weekly Wind-Up. Each week we bring you up to date on all the latest issues going on in the Kirklees area. We aim to be interesting, amusing, challenging and of course provocative. But we're not just satisfied with talking to you, we want you to talk back to us. And if you have any comments regarding what's discussed here today, you can contact us by email on info@kirkleeslocaltv.com and you can find us on Twitter by searching @KirkleesLocalTV. On our panel this week, the chairman of the campaign group Save Mirfield, Cheryl Tyler, the independent councillor for the Easthorpe ward in Mirfield, David Pinder, and our KLTV resident panellist, Carl Warwick. Welcome to you all, a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, now on to our first issue for this week. The developer Spillway Homes have tabled a rather controversial planning application for over 130 houses on Balderston Fields in Mirfield. The application comes as one of three major proposed developments in the Mirfield area, with Ben Bailey Homes proposing over 30 houses off Lady Heaton Drive and Taylor Wimpey proposing another major development of 160 plus houses on the high profile piece of land known as Mirfield Moor. Now, Cheryl, I'll start with you on this. Please give us some background to this and why is this such a controversial issue in the Mirfield area?
Well, it's because Spillway tried to get planning permission to build on the land about 15 years ago, perhaps a bit longer than that. And as far as we're concerned, the reasons why it was refused at that time still stand. And in fact, probably some of the reasons have got worse since then. The thing is that the site itself is very difficult from the point of view of access. One of the big problems that we've got in Mirfield is that the infrastructure is very overburdened. Sure. And the roads in particular are roads of a semi-rural small town. They're not wide and we're very heavily populated in the north of Mirfield. The actual access to Balderston Hall Fields in the application is out onto a road called Woodward Court. Now, I won't want to go into detail for everyone won't know where that is, but it's a very small, narrow road that two cars can just about pass in. And the site is very, very close to a school, a junior school. And we feel that the number of cars that are going to be coming off site, because these days an awful lot of houses have more than two cars, and most of them have two. If there are going to be 134 houses on that site, and you double that up for the number of cars, the issue is going to be around actual access, safety, pollution, all those kind of things. You know, we feel that the developers have just scented blood, really, because the local development framework plan that Kirklees should have had in place and should have done that over the last 10 years didn't. For whatever reason, it doesn't really matter that we go into that. The fact is there is no LDF. And so because Mirfield is considered a very nice place to live and they can get quite a lot of money for the houses that they build there, we've become really a focus for developers, including Spillway.
Councillor Pinder, as a town councillor in Mirfield, how do you approach this in terms of when large developments come to your area, and what would your objections be, if any?
Well, there might not be objections depending on what the plan is. I mean, it's just been put very well in this particular case. There are many facets to this, so it's very difficult to say what your approach is going to be. But for instance, we have this argument that there's a housing shortage. There may well be nationally, there may well be in the southeast. But if you actually spend half a morning, as I did last week, going around estate agents, you'll find there are hundreds of properties, both for sale and rent, and some of them start at £80,000 to buy up to whatever you can pay. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure where this shortage comes from. The other problem is, of course, that when you get national developers coming in, they're wanting to cram in the maximum number of houses in the minimum amount of space for the maximum return.
Yeah.
That isn't the case very often with local builders. And again, if you look at the sums for Mirfield, you'll find that in the last 20 years, over a couple of hundred houses have built in Mirfield. Several mills have been converted into flats. There is not a NIMBY argument about this. If they can be put in place and they can be put in discreetly, there's no problem to it. If you start to say 100 houses are going in here, in a place where there's been no houses, and incidentally, of course, these aren't, by and large, they're not brownfield sites, of which we have plenty, but no developer in his right mind wants to use a brownfield site if you can con a greenfield site out of local government. But those sites very often do not plan effectively the infrastructure.
Sure.
And the point's been made about roads. You also have to remember, of course, that Mirfield is cut through by 2 trunk roads. Those roads are packed. Everybody knows that. Kirklees know that. That's why there's all the furore about the Three Nuns area there. If you then suddenly say you're going to put 300, in this case, more people into a town of about 18,000, those people will all work. They may well have 2 or 3 cars. If you don't improve the infrastructure, if you don't expand the size of the local health clinics, the schools, then you are overfacing that area. And those are the grounds upon which we would object. The other factor we have more locally is that I'm afraid Kirklees does not have a very good pedigree when it comes to enforcing the 106 agreements. I don't know if your viewers would know what a 106 agreement is, but basically you can say to a developer, okay, you can come in here, but we want you to pay for improving that, or we want you to do this. The record of actually enforcing even the ones they agree is woeful. And so there's no confidence on the part of councillors like myself and local residents that these things will be planned sympathetically. And even if they are, there's no guarantee that the conditions will be enforced.
Sure, sure. Kyle, you obviously live in a very nice area yourself, rural village, Marsden. Is there any impact on development in your area in terms of overdevelopment and placing of far too many houses?
Well, I mean, in recent years, in the last 10 years, there has been a quite big development in Marsden of around 50 to 60 houses, I'd say. That was all built on a site of where there hadn't been any houses built on before. And some of the problems that came after the houses were put on that site could have really been foreseen beforehand. There's water that used to run down into the grassland and was soaked up by the grassland. Now that entire area has been tarmacked over, all that water is feeding down onto a further bit of grassland, which has turned it from a recreational space into a marshland.
This highlights another problem, of course, which we have. You've got Victorian Edwardian sewers that were originally designed to perhaps feed 70 houses, which over the years have now got 300, 400, 700 houses feeding into those same sewers. If you then block another 150 houses with no expansion of that system, then you get what we're having in Mirfield. A bit of rain comes along and suddenly people's toilets are flooding up. There are people with cellar pumps that are going 24/7. These are all things that should be taken care of strategically.
Yeah.
But of course the developers won't do that because it's extra expense.
Sure.
Can I make a
Yeah.
comment? Save Mirfield is not we're not having any building organisation.
Sure. Yeah, so it's not a case of we don't want anything
No,
here whatsoever.
I mean we recognise that there's got to be some development, but what we're interested in is making sure that it's sustainable. And I've just got in front of me the ministerial foreword for the MPPF document, which is the National Planning Policy Framework document, and it says sustainable means ensuring that better lives for ourselves don't mean worse lives for future generations. And that's the problem in Mirfield. We're very densely populated. There are 14.5 people per hectare in North Kirklees and in the north of Mirfield, and that is much greater than the average for England and is amongst the highest in the whole of Kirklees. So we've already become very saturated with people. Sure. But unfortunately, as David's just said, we've got one doctor's surgery with a number of GPs, and it's really, really difficult to get any kind of appointment there, and especially if you want one in a hurry. And the schools are oversubscribed. So just building unsustainably is not the answer.
Sure.
Just plonking them in because you've got a space. And David brought up something very important, is the developers like building on greenfield because it's cheaper for them. Well, that's a shame, but if brownfield sites are available, we think in Save Mirfield that they should be prioritised.
Sure. Okay.
I think it's got a lot to do with who it's going to benefit as well. Is the development going to benefit solely the developers themselves, or is it actually going to benefit the people of Mirfield?
Yes, exactly.
And if the developers can't show that it's going to benefit the people and the town of Mirfield, then I don't think it's right to build houses in such vast numbers.
Yeah. Well, definitely a controversial issue, and I'm sure one that will raise a great level of discussion among residents. We're going to take a quick break right now. If you have any comments regarding what we've discussed so far, remember you can contact us on email on info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, and you can find us on Twitter by searching @KirkleesLocalTV. See you after the break. Welcome back. My name is Thomas Hurst and you're watching Kirklees Local TV's Weekly Wind-Up. Now on to our next issue for this week. A campaign which is in place to see an historic reservoir spillway saved and preserved is to be stepped up. This comes after the news that Yorkshire Water are to appeal the decision made by Kirklees Council after the original plans were rejected in January. This is of course plans to make a new development on Butterley Spillway in Marsden. Kyle, you're the expert on this. I'll let you give us some details.
I wouldn't claim to be an expert, Tom. I have to admit most of my information comes from an extremely informed lady, Diane Ellis, who must take a lot of the credit for a lot of the good work that's been done by the Butterley Spillway group in terms of researching the heritage of the site, which is massive to the village really. I mean, Marsden is a village that for 20 years has kind of been recovering from the death of the textile industry. And one of the main ways that our village has been able to do that is through tourism and through heritage and through natural beauty in the area. And Butterley Spillway for Marsden plays quite a big part in that. It's got a lot of heritage behind it in terms of not just Marsden but the entirety of Huddersfield. The group of people that, or the workers, the navvies that built the spillway then went on to build Huddersfield's first public park up at Beaumont Park. So it's not just an issue for Marsden, I'd say, but really the view of a lot of Marsden residents is that Yorkshire Water as a company are quite happy to drain as much money out of their customers' pockets without actually wanting to reinvest any or reinvest as little as possible into the infrastructure.
So if I understand correctly, your general disappointment is that not a lot of people are really seeing much for the money that's taken off them in terms of investing in infrastructure, water rates being capped or even been lowered given the income of the company.
Well, I mean, I think there was a statistic that said that each year your water bill goes up on average by 6.6%,
yeah.
And around 92% of that 6.6% goes to profit for the company, which that's just sort of, you're already making hundreds of millions of pounds worth of profit, and then you're raising somebody's bill just to make a bit more profit. It seems very Sheriff of Nottingham to me, really. It's just taking as much as they can. But there's been a big sort of fight back in Marsden, led by the Butterley Spillway group and supported extremely well by the councillors in the area. Nicola Turner's been a very vocal supporter of the Butterley Spillway group. And really, I think Yorkshire Water, I mean, there's some in the village that have this sceptical view that Yorkshire Water put in a plan that was much beyond what they actually wanted, so that when that got knocked back, then their next plan would come in and that would seem more reasonable to people, and that would be the plan that they actually wanted making. So they'll be happy with that plan going through. But for the people of Marsden, really, we understand that there is a risk there, and they've assessed the situation and deemed there to be a risk to the village, and nobody's doubting that something needs to be done. All that the people of Marsden are doubting is the necessity to rip out something that is iconic to our village, really. Not just to the people that live in Marsden, but the people that visit Marsden, the walkers and the bike riders, and people that come to the jazz festival and things like that. It's something that you can go and see and you can have a look at and you can walk past. It's in an area of really, I think, outstanding natural beauty. There's the Wessenden Valley that follows it. It's a beautiful place. It's sort of 7 miles of idyllic walking, really. And Yorkshire Water's plans are to take something that is really blended into that landscape really nicely. Yeah. Rip it out and replace it with something that, when you look at their plans, it will only be an eyesore, really.
Yeah, yeah. An eyesore of modern engineering, basically, or something of the sort. Yeah. Well, Cheryl, we can identify a trend here that there are people across Kirklees maybe not getting the results from private developers, people bringing in changes to the infrastructure in the area. What's your view on this particular issue?
Well, I'm quite familiar with Marsden because I go there quite often because there's some good pubs. And I go to the jazz festival, so I am familiar with the area and walk as well around. I don't know this particular building, or at least I may have seen it and not realised what it was. What's concerning me about it is that Yorkshire Water are going to appeal because Kirklees Council don't have a good record in upholding their own end, if you like, when things go to appeal. They seem to quite often just roll over and say, oh, okay then. And this is quite worrying. So when it does go to appeal, the people that are trying to stop this need to be very clued up and make sure that they present a good case when they go to appeal.
Okay, we're hearing a lot on the issue. I'll move on to you, David. What are your...
Yeah, I mean, a lot's been said, which is useful, but one of the bigger issues is, and it's a national one as well as a local one, I'm afraid most politicians and civil servants are not terribly good at negotiating deals with private industry. A friend of mine who's a lawyer said that's because the best lawyers tend not to go into local government. But I wouldn't like to comment beyond that. But it is a fact that both nationally and locally, they're not very good when it comes to negotiating these contracts. So the ability to find a genuine business person as opposed to a shyster, let's say, in this part of the world, isn't always very well defined. That's the first issue. The second issue is more locally with Kirklees. You would have thought that an authority that named itself after Robin Hood's alleged grave would have had a feeling for history. Kirklees has no feeling for history as far as I've seen, and I speak as a historian. I'm not someone who says history should always be preserved, but it is a factor. And if you look at the state of some of our historic buildings in Mirfield, you look at the state of some of the towns, you look at the state of, say, Blackdick's Tower, Kirklees' record on preserving historic features and the possible tourism and economic benefits from those is frankly woeful.
Okay, well, some interesting discussion on this topic as well. We're going to take another break right now. If you have any comments regarding our discussion of Butterley Spillway or the proposed developments in Mirfield, you can send us comments by email on info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, and you can find us on Twitter by searching @KirkleesLocalTV. See you after the break. Now, in light of the local elections coming up soon, Kirklees has been identified as a high-risk area for voter fraud and intimidation. There has been identified a risk of such fraud in areas such as Calderdale, and of course there was the findings from Dewsbury from the last elections in 2012 in that area. David, I'll start with you on this. What are the issues that are really unfolding here, and what needs to be done?
Postal voting was always slightly flawed as a system because it couldn't be supervised. There may well be reasons for giving people a postal vote. I would accept those, but unless you've got sufficient security involved, it is very difficult to know whether somebody actually filled it in themselves, or whether a particular party went round and got people to fill them in under instruction. That's not unusual. I do remember as a young officer when the forces got given the vote, the RSM of the regiment I was in formed the regiment up in the gymnasium with the voting forms and said, right, you will all put across where the Conservatives are, picked them up and posted them off. So it's not an ethnic thing. It's a system that's eligible to, for fraud. But I think the other one is that where you have very emotive politics these days, you do get intimidation. And we've seen some very broad examples of that. And again, I'm going to come across as a Kirklees critic, as it were, but I hope a well-intentioned one. They have not always been sufficiently robust in accepting the evidence that that has happened.
What are your thoughts on this, Kyle?
Well, I mean, call me naive, but I kind of presumed that these were the kind of things that we didn't allow to go on as a organised Western
it's a banana republic
establishment,
kind of
but it's I can suppose I can see intimidation being a problem possibly, but I think that's something that can be spotted at the voter booths, and I think it's for the voter themselves to make sure that their vote is the one that they're casting, I suppose, and make sure that they make it known if they feel like they're being intimidated by somebody or somebody is attempting to post their vote fraudulently. I think it's you've got to be proud about your vote, really, haven't you?
Sure.
I suppose.
Yeah. Cheryl, what's wrong with us in Kirklees? What are we doing? Oh, in Calderdale as well.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that originally, I mean, I've been voting for over 40 years, but when they changed the rules about postal voting, it used to be that you could have a postal vote if you were too ill to attend and that kind of thing. I think it's got a bit slack. I think that we've turned into a bit of a lazy group, really. If people who are able-bodied and are not in hospital or not on holiday or something like that, I don't think postal voting is appropriate. I think that we should turn slightly back and say, okay, we're going to reduce the reasons for postal voting and make sure that people take the trouble to go and cast a vote in a booth.
So if I understand you correctly, we're now getting not just people who may be ill or not mobile enough using postal votes, and as they rightly should be, is we're getting lazy as a whole and saying, I'm outside half a mile of a polling station, so I'll get the postal vote instead.
Well, I know people that live within 50 yards of polling station and they always have postal voting, and we've had quite heated arguments about that.
It's also too easy to apply for a postal vote.
Yeah.
And I know in Kirklees they have had a few cases, and it is only a few, where 8 people have been registered at a particular house and had a postal vote, but there weren't 8 people living in that house. But it's very difficult to work it out and check it and supervise it on that scale.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this week. As always, please remember to send us your comments, and we'd love to hear what you think. To do this, you can contact us by email on info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, and you can find us on Twitter by searching @KirkleesLocalTV. A big thank you to all our guests today, Cheryl, David and Kyle. Pleasure to have you on. I'm Thomas Hurst, and you've been watching Kirklees Local TV's Weekly Wind-Up. We look forward to you tuning in again next week. Goodbye.